Socrates talks about death in Plato's Apology, which I think everyone should read. If you're a fast reader, you can maybe read it in like an hour and a half or something like that. Right? It's the one book that I recommend that everyone should read because he's about to die. So he contemplates his own mortality. He says some interesting things about it, but he doesn't talk about it extensively. Like, he talks about it a little bit more in Plato's Phaedo, but there's a pseudo-Platonic text called the Axiochus. And by pseudo-Platonic, I mean that it purports to be written by Plato. It's written in his style, but we believe it was, and people in the ancient world believe it was probably written by someone else, maybe one of his students or successors. And the Axiochus is all about death. Like, it's all about contemplating your own mortality. There's a guy who's a friend of Socrates who's dying and freaking out, and Socrates is summoned to come and talk to him and help to console him a bit about his own mortality. So that's where to look for some inspiration in this regard. I mean, many of the arguments that we find in the Axiochus and elsewhere in ancient literature are very old. Some of them are more associated with the Stoics. We see the Stoics really lean. Often in the Socratic dialogues, you get these things that are said in passing, and then the Stoics latch onto them and really develop them more and more. So there are many different things. I'll rattle through. So I don't expect, and even in the ancient world, people were seldom convinced by some of these arguments. But Socrates said it's almost like though Socrates said, speaking to the wise sometimes is like being bitten by a small insect, like a midge, right? So you might not even notice when it happens. But then hours later, or maybe even the next day, it starts to itch. And you think, man, something must have bit me. It was probably yesterday when I was wandering about in the middle of nowhere, like looking at a loch or something, or a glen. Like, something got me yesterday. And that's what Socrates' students used to say. They'd be like, man, like, something's bugging me. And I think it was something Socrates said like a week ago, right? It's kind of been bothering me ever since, right? So at the time, it seemed ridiculous. There's things that I read in Plato's dialogues that seemed trivial, superficial, ridiculous to me. 20 years later, they were still bothering me. Like 30 years later, they still bother me today. So some of the things he says. So Socrates says fear of death is a kind of intellectual conceit. He says, look, there are two possibilities, basically. He says either it's like being unconscious forever, right? Which is neither good nor bad. Like, you would just be unconscious. Like, you wouldn't experience any pain or any happiness. It would be indifferent. It would be like sleeping forever. And so there's no you there to suffer. It's non-existent. So it's kind of, there's a neutrality about it. And some people would say, well, in the Axiochus, the guy he's talking to is like half convinced by this. And he's like, okay. But like, I'd be deprived of pleasure. There's a lot of nice things in life and I'd be deprived of those. And Socrates, if I was completely unconscious forever. And Socrates says, but you wouldn't be conscious of the deprivation. You would be unconscious of the deprivation. So what difference does it make? And he's like, okay, they're still seeing something weird about this. Like, and Socrates said, but also you've already been unconscious for an eternity. Before you were born, you didn't exist. And that doesn't bother you. Like, so why should you be bothered about the fact that you'll be non-existent again in the future? This is the argument from symmetry. It's a weird argument, but everyone always remembers it. Like, he says, for an eternity, figuratively speaking, for a quasi-eternity, for almost an eternity, before you were born, you didn't exist, and there was just oblivion. Like, and then in the future, after you're dead, the same thing happens. You're returning to the same state that you were in before you were born, a state of complete and utter non-existence and oblivion and unconsciousness. Like, but you don't worry about it. You don't sit there thinking, man, that really sucked that I was unconscious and non-existent for a gazillion years before I was born. I really resent that. It kind of ruined my childhood, actually. Like, thinking about it, Socrates said, so why would you fear returning to that state of non-existence that doesn't bother you in retrospect? It's an odd argument, but it's an interesting argument. So he says, like, we should be indifferent to non-existence. He said the alternative is that we continue to exist, but we don't know what it's going to be like, right? Now, I think the argument that he implies is that for a philosopher who values wisdom and virtue more than external goods, that in the afterlife, as long as you're conscious, you would be able to continue doing philosophy, right? You'd be able to continue using the Socratic method. You'd be able to continue reflecting on things. And so Socrates says, if I'm conscious and able to continue reasoning in the afterlife, even if the afterlife kind of sucked or whatever, like the external things don't really matter that much to me anyway. Like, what really matters to me more than anything else is the ability to think about things and question them. Like, so I don't know what's going to happen in the afterlife. Either I'm unconscious, in which case I'd be indifferent, or I'd be conscious, in which case whether it's heaven or hell or purgatory, it doesn't really matter to me as long as I'm able to think about it. I can carry on doing philosophy, and whoever I meet in the afterlife, if I meet anyone, I'd be able to carry on doing the same thing that I do now. Like, so I'd be happy. Like, I'd continue to be fulfilled, is his argument. And those are some of the things. The other philosophers, this view is attributed to Socrates sometimes. And again, it's not a convincing argument to many people, but it kind of sticks with them. The Stoics repeat an argument that is attributed a couple of times to Socrates, but really more associated with the natural philosophers that came before him, which is the idea that death is a natural process. It's really just a change of state. Like, they would say, in a sense, you're not really destroyed, just that the molecules in your body are rearranged, like, and put in a different form. They were materialists, right? They didn't think there was like an immortal spirit. They just think, you're just a bunch of atoms. And they said, just like you could take a piece of wax and mold it into the shape of a little person, you could also squash it flat or mold it into the shape of a horse, but it's like the wax still continues to exist. And so for some people, viewing death as just a natural process of transformation seems to be a consolation. To other people, they're like, well, that doesn't make any difference to me. Like, I'm still worried about the fact that I wouldn't exist. But some people throughout history have found that perspective strangely consoling, right? So you kind of find that idea in Socrates, attributed sometimes to Socrates as well.